There's an old saying that goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. We are living in a world of extreme crisis and turmoil with sudden and sharp shifts. At every level, society is experiencing upheavals on a daily basis. Now, the point of this podcast is not to accumulate a heap of facts following every thread of this development, and neither is it to find interesting angles that can make us look clever, if we do. But it is to follow events closely in order to find the underlying processes in society. Why? So that we can arm a new generation of communists and revolutionaries with an understanding of the society we are living in, so that we can change it. My name is Hamid Alizadeh. I'm here today with Jorge Martín. Welcome back to the second season of Against the Stream. Jorge, here we are again.
Yes.
We started this about less than a year ago, October last year.
Yeah.
In a meeting room with a phone in front of us.
That's right. It was an X Spaces, wasn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And here we are with a modernized studio,
Yeah.
Studio Mark II. We've had a break for about 2 months, I think. And in that break, we've had lots of things happening. We have been at the World Congress of the Revolutionary Communists International, where we discussed the main developments in the world today and developed a strategy and a tactic for building our organization.
Yes, there was actually an uproar of protest when the break for the podcast was announced, and I've had comrades all over the summer saying, "When are you coming back? When are you coming back?" So, the World Congress of the Revolutionary Communist International took place in Italy at the beginning of August. And yes, one of the main points of discussion, the discussion centered mainly around this question of the developments in world relations, the rise of China, the relative decline of the United States. And we discussed it at quite some length. And from many different angles, there was some interesting discussions about, for instance, the struggle for the Arctic, the question of Chinese development in top technology industries. But also, we discussed quite a lot about the crisis in Europe, isn't it? There was comrades who spoke about the crisis of capitalism in Germany, in France, in Spain, in Britain. I thought it was a very good meeting because, as you say, lots of things are happening, lots of things are changing, and we need to understand what are the processes behind all of this.
Yes.
And the purpose of understanding is not just for our own intellectual gratification, but because we are building a revolutionary organization that can intervene in these events and change the course of history.
Yes, precisely. With that said, I think we should dive in. We have a lot of interesting material today. A lot has happened in the past couple of months. We can't comment on all of it. Unfortunately, we will do that in the next weeks and months. In particular, Israel and its onslaught on Gaza we'll have to deal with another time. But we will be discussing Donald Trump, the crisis of American imperialism, the rise of China. Again, one of the main characteristics of the world situation today, one of the most prominent factors. The decline of Europe, the crisis of Europe. The rising class struggle, and also revolutionary events in Indonesia, which is obviously a very important country in Asia. But let's start with Trump, or let's start with China. We had the military parade in China 2 days ago. Was it yesterday? 2 days ago, and. When you see headlines about China, there's kind of two kind of how do you say strands, right? One is the kind of lesser papers, the ones who are looking for more kind of sensationalist headlines. They're all, the rise of China, this and that, and then the more sober kind of capitalist bourgeois who are more saying, well, it's not really something to worry about. And, in the main papers are not that China mongering, right? But this military parade was big and was very significant, and I could sense a sense of panic when you were reading the bourgeois media, all of them, Financial Times, The Economist. I mean, we'll get to that later. The Foreign Policy wrote an article saying China's military is now leading. Well, that's a warning sign coming from a pretty prominent established magazine. But this was in a way, this was a culmination of everything that's been taking place in world relations in the past 2 months. A lot has happened because it started off, I can't remember if this was before we went on break or not, but Trump issuing an ultimatum on Putin saying you got 50 days to reach some sort of an agreement in Ukraine. Otherwise,
he did.
Tariffs.
Yeah, he did threaten with secondary tariffs.
Secondary tariffs, 100% tariffs, and hail and brimstone, as they say. Then he's changed it to say, oh no, he's got 10 or 12 days. And before that was over, he organized a summit with Putin. So we're going to reach a deal now. That big things are happening. And coming out of that, he did actually impose a series of sanctions, but in particular on India, where he slapped 25% tariffs on top of the already 25% tariffs that they've slapped onto India previously.
As a punishment for India continuing to trade with Russia, and particularly India resells Russia's oil onto the world market.
Precisely. And after all of this posturing, after all of these threats and attacks, what happens is that we have this military day parade. Who's there? Is Putin, Xi Jinping. This came after a week of meetings in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was an organization that existed for some years. It's not been that prominent for anyone but China. But this time around, who was there? Putin was there. Modi was there. The Iranian president was there. The Kim Jong-un was there. Erdogan was there. Vucic, I believe, from Serbia was there. Fico was there.
From
Slovakia. And many others. Armenia and Azerbaijan. Trump says that he was the one who got this peace deal through between both of those presidents were there. And in fact, rather than negotiating with the Americans and appease and kind of bending to the pressure that Trump put, the Indians in particular have looked the other way.
Yes.
They say that the Americans keep calling Modi, but he's not.
This was
not picking up the phone.
Headline in the Telegraph that since these tariffs were imposed on China, these retaliatory tariffs, Trump has called Modi 4 times.
Not on China, on India, I mean.
Sorry, on India.
Yes.
Trump has called Modi 4 times and he hasn't picked up. And it's had the opposite effect. It's really backfired, imperialist bullying no longer has the same, imperialist bullying on the part of the United States no longer has the same impact it might have had 20 or 30 years ago.
Precisely. In fact, Modi and Putin have been making statements about their dear friends and brothers.
They were together in the car and they were talking to each other and this and that.
Modi drove in Putin's official car.
Yeah.
And Putin drove in Trump's official car when he was in.
Yes.
So all of this obviously is a spectacle, but it is telling of...
It's sending a message.
It's sending a message, and it is telling of a new world situation.
Yes. And in fact, if you think about it, when this Shanghai Cooperation Organization was originally set up, it was mainly Russia and China, and then a few Central Asian republics. But now a whole number of other people have joined, including India has now joined as a member. Some of the other people who were there are only associated or observers and so on. But the line of march is clear. A number of countries that have been bullied by US imperialism are now turning towards China. There is another pole of power that they can they can lean on if they are threatened by the United States. The United States is basically losing friends by alienating its own friends and allies by its own actions, its own bullying.
Yes, I mean, Trump criticized Biden for pushing Russia into the arms of China by instigating the war in Ukraine. And he was right. He's doing the same thing with India.
Yes.
India and China had very cold relations up until recently.
Yes.
But the pushes of the Americans has continuously pushed India closer and closer into the arms of China.
And in fact, if you think about it, at the beginning, Modi and Trump were quite friendly with each other. They're similar characters, you know, right-wing demagogues, basing themselves on nationalism and so on. And they coincided on many things, and they had a very good relationship at the beginning. Now, the relationship is completely frozen, and Trump, to all intents and purposes, has pushed India into the arms of China, which is unprecedented.
Yes. You wrote, actually, you drafted our World Perspectives document, which is the document that we discussed at the our World Congress. It's on the website. We'll be linking to it in this video as well, which is kind of taking stock of the general world situation. And there is a sentence there, a paragraph, which goes as such: the world situation is dominated by enormous instability in world relations. This is the result of the struggle for world hegemony between the US, the world's most powerful imperialist power, which is in relative decline, and China, a more dynamic, rising imperialist power. We are witnessing a tremendous shift comparable in scale to the movement of the tectonic plates on the Earth's crust. I think that's pretty...
This is actually Alan's idea. I put it in the document, but he's the one who developed this idea of the shifting of the tectonic plates as a parallel for the shift in world relations. And you can see it in everything. The other thing that's been happening, which is kind of parallel to this India question, the other country that's been slapped with 50% tariffs by Trump this summer is Brazil.
Yeah.
And Trump was trying to use tariffs in this particular case for political reasons, to put pressure on Brazil not to proceed with the sentencing of Bolsonaro, which is made.
Yeah.
There are other reasons why the United States is in conflict with Brazil. The other reasons are, one, the treatment of U.S. technology companies inside Brazil.
Yeah.
But another one is Brazil's alignment with the BRICS and all these ideas of creating a BRICS currency and so on. Trump is obviously not very happy with this. He said this openly. He said anyone who moves away from the dollar, they'll have 100% tariffs slapped on them. And so at the beginning of on August the 1st, I think, these tariffs came into effect, 50% tariffs on Brazilian products. And what's been happening is that China has stepped in and they said, this is no way to treat your friends. This is unacceptable. And we will take any products that Brazil now wants to sell to us. They've expedited licenses for importation for 138 coffee producers from Brazil. They're also taking in more soybeans from Brazil and meat products. And this is quite interesting because one of the main exports of the United States to China is precisely agricultural and meat products. Yeah. Soybeans particularly. Brazil exports the same items to China, so China can find a replacement for US products in Brazil, and Brazil can find a replacement for its markets in China. So this plays plays quite nicely into their own benefit. But what it means is that a person like Lula, who is just a weak reformist president who relies on a government of national unity with different bourgeois parties, now can stand up to Trump and say, okay, well, you impose tariffs on us. We will not accept it. Yeah. And we will not change our policy. And we will bring ourselves closer to China, which is now investing in Brazil to a large degree. Yeah. This is the mechanics of what is happening.
Yeah, and this is something we've seen increasingly in the past decade, really, that that American bullying, America is the main imperialist power in the world. There's not China, not Russia, and no one else is anywhere close to the level of influence and domination that America exerts. It's a hegemony.
Yes.
It's a hegemonic power. But the way that they got used to acting after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was wading in to any country, changing governments, overthrowing, invading, dictating, wielding enormous political influence through all sorts of formal and informal levers, doesn't work anymore. And
they were able to do that without any opposition.
Yeah.
All the other, let's say, powers or strong countries around, they will all go along with it and support the United States.
They were almost all powerful.
Not anymore.
And what we see now is that in the past years, the attempts of America at bullying is actually it's actually isolating. America tries to mobilize the whole world, but they actually do the opposite.
Yes.
When they froze Russian assets in Europe, what is it, 300 or 500 billion dollars? At the start of the Ukraine war, that didn't create a sense of Russia is isolated. That created the sense in the whole world that we can't trust the American system.
That's right.
Because they can use it against us. Then they started imposing sanctions. You can impose sanctions on a country like Iran, which is relatively small. Although even there, the sanctions don't quite work because Iran has got oil and gas that people need. But Russia, which is one of the biggest agricultural and chemical producers in the world, and all sorts of other things, you can't. And what we saw was that it completely backfired. That the only countries that America could get on side were basically the West, Western aligned countries, and Singapore. As far as I know, everyone else, the vast majority of the world's population, not the vast majority of its economy, but the world's population, the countries that they live in, they went against. Yes. And now here you have, again, the same thing. Trump is trying, again, with bullying, with pressuring, but it's actually serving to undermine the system as a whole. The dollar now, up until recently, there was no question of the dollar being replaced. No one wanted to replace the dollar. But everyone can see, well, they're weaponizing the dollar. So what if we are not friends with the US tomorrow? What if we do something that enrages Trump or whoever's in power? We need to have a different system. At this Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, they set up a new development bank, which is along with the BRICS Bank, which is kind of, again, a competitor to the IMF and the World Banks.
Actually, right now, China has become the world's main creditor. So China is lending more money to other countries, mainly third world countries. Yeah. But it's lending more money than Western financial institutions, the IMF and so on.
Yeah. There is a theory in war which says that the real balance of forces become clear at the point of contact, at first contact. What does that mean? It means that you can have a big army, but underneath there can be a lot of rot and inefficiencies. And we can have another army on the other side which might seem weak on the surface of it, but tested in direct combat proves to have a higher quality. And I think that's what we kind of see. The real balance of forces are coming to the fore now. We had a situation after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a world system of governance, as the bourgeois call it, completely dominated by America. All of the main institutions controlled by the West. But underneath, that was based on a situation where Russia had collapsed. China was what they called an emerging market, a backward economy, more or less. India was in a very, very bad state. Countries like Turkey, Brazil, Iran, in a deep economic crisis, and America was booming, and the West was booming. But in the meantime, something has happened, that the underlying situation has changed. The Chinese industry we talked about a lot. All of these countries, in fact, have modernized, have greatly advanced from a very, very low place, which means that the general balance of forces is not the same anymore. Economically, militarily, we'll get into that. There's the total domination of America is no longer justified. And when they try to assert or use this system in order to punish anyone who goes against, this is what's becoming visible. That's what we're seeing in China.
And if you want to understand that, I will say a good place to start is Lenin's Imperialism, Lenin's book on imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, because there he talks about the relative balance between the powers changing all the time, and therefore this is what leads to war and conflict between the imperialist powers, because the economy is developing at different rates. Some are going up, some are going down, and then the balance needs to be reestablished on the basis of the new balance of forces, and this is what's really happening now.
Yes, let's see how that proves in practice, in real terms. This article from the Foreign Policy, China's military is now leading, it says. That's a very alarmist headline by the director, Sam Rogervin, Director of International Security Program at the Lowy Institute. Anyway, he starts his article by saying that China is now advancing technologically and industrially, and he lists the sectors: robotics, electric vehicles, nuclear reactors, solar energy, drones, high-speed rails, and AI. So this is the underlying economic development. But then he goes on to say this has an equal military aspect to it. And he says that it's no longer enough to say that China's military is catching up or that it is copying foreign military equipment designs. China is now innovating and is leading. In the process, the regional military balance that has for decades favored the United States and its partners is being irrevocably changed. And he goes on to list, among the highlights the display, among the highlights of the parade was the display of aircraft that will serve aboard China's growing fleet of aircraft carriers, which numbers 3 ships at present. I think that makes them the second or third. I think they're the second aircraft carrier force in the world. The US, of course, has like 10. But it's likely to be joined in the coming years by at least one nuclear-powered supercarrier just as large and capable as the US Navy's new Gerald Ford class. This is not a small thing. This is the most advanced weapon on the planet, the ones that the Americans have. And what they've been saying for years is that, China can build aircraft carriers, but they're not as good as the Western ones. But actually now, technologically, they've caught up, and they're now building equal-level aircraft carriers and the planes to go with it. And then they say, there's also 4 new types of loyal wingmen drones, which are stealthy, unpiloted planes designed to fly alongside crewed aircraft and to be tasked by them. And there was also at least 4 previously unseen anti-ship and ground attack missile systems, as well as new uncrewed submarines and torpedoes. And he goes on to say that if there was research shows that if there was a clash, so let's say over Taiwan, within a very brief period of time, 45% of American forces in the region would be destroyed, in the best case scenario, by the Chinese military.
I think this is the bit that they are most worried about, the development of these missiles and drones, some of which are hypersonic missiles, and they will be very effective against in a naval conflict with the United States. That's what they're worried about.
Yeah, so they write about this parade. They say, this was a gathering of authoritarian men, and Trump was complaining. It was like
he wasn't invited.
He wasn't invited, basically. Yes.
He says, he said, I think they were planning for me to watch it, and I was watching it, even despite the time difference or something like that.
I mean, the post that he made were hilarious.
Well, yes, they are plotting.
They're plotting, conspiring against us.
Say hi to them.
Very nice parade. Say hi to everyone. He wasn't invited to the party.
He clearly feels left out.
Yeah. Of course, the question is the authoritarian states, but what business does the US have patrolling the seaways on the other side of the world?
Yes.
In China's neighborhood, right?
Yes. The other interesting thing is also that, you see, we just talked about India being present at this security conference, this cooperation, Shanghai Cooperation Summit. But in fact, India is part of a military alliance with the United States, the Quad. So that is quite significant. That even from a military point of view, we'll see whether this alliance remains or not.
Now, this article, I'd like to end this because I think it hits the nail on the head at the end. It says, to address the deteriorating military balance in East Asia, the United States could massively expand its presence there, yet there seems to be little prospect of it. China has been modernizing its military for over 30 years now, without a substantial U.S. response. Why would we expect that to change now? And even if Washington could overcome its inertia, I think this is the key word here, we can talk about that, which Asian country would agree to host all these forces, and which would offer the U.S. a guarantee that it would allow its territory to be used in a war against China. I think the key word here is inertia, because it's what we're talking about is economic inertia. Is it inertia in American industry, the American economy, which does develop in certain sectors such as AI and software, but is enormously bound up with finance capital, speculation, whereas China has developed a powerful industrial base, which is modernizing and taking more steps forward. In that way, you can say China is using the privilege of backwardness, as Trotsky called it, whereas America is weighed down by all of this previous development. Inertia is it's not a force, but it's an element in physics, in classical mechanics. You know, the more you basically say, the more mass something has, the more difficult is it for it to move and change its state. And you can convert that to social science as well. In history, the more developed a social system is, at the same time it becomes more sclerotic and conservative and inflexible. Whereas you have China, which comes from a much lower base, developing on nothing, and which therefore has the flexibility of youth in a way.
Yes.
And he ends by saying, finally, if those barriers are overcome, i.e. the inertia of America, China would almost certainly respond with increased military spending of its own. And as the military parade in Beijing reminded the world this week, an arms race would now play to Beijing's strength, not to Washington's. That's an obituary.
For instance, they were talking about the naval building capacity of China. They have these dual shipyards.
Yes.
And I think that the figure they were giving is that the capacity of shipbuilding for China is 200 times that of the United States, which has mostly outsourced the building of its navy and so on. And they saying that in a protracted military conflict, this will play clearly to China's advantage.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's a big difference. We also have to say, I think it's worth mentioning that obviously China is a capitalist country, is a peculiar capitalist country because the state plays a big role in the economy. But by leaping forward in technology and industry and so on, it's also building up its own contradictions. Contradictions of massive overcapacity, which then they have to unload onto the world market. A world market that now is more fractured and driven by protectionist contradictions.
Yeah.
And also, I will say, also the massive problem of the increased organic composition of capital. The massive replacement of workers by robots and automated systems and so on. This will eventually mean that the China's will come up against its own limits. But at the moment, China is the dynamic, young, upcoming imperialist power. Yeah. And the United States, even though it's still dominant on the world arena, but it's suffering from a relative decline and it's lagging behind.
You can compare it with America coming up as Britain was going down. America, I mean, first of all, was a colony of Britain. Yeah. In the same way you can say China was developed through Western investments in a way. But at a certain point, it acquires its independence, its own independent base. And again, on the basis of the privilege of backwardness, of not having this old economy and old structures to kind of as fetters, it was able to develop on a much, much, much higher rate. But obviously, it's now going into, and that process will also happen to China at a certain point, and is by no means guaranteed that will take as long as America took.
No. In fact, if you look at the rate of economic growth of China, which used to be 10% 5 or 10 years ago, it's now gone down to 4 or 5%. It's still much higher than the West.
Yeah.
I mean, in Britain, they're now throwing rockets because there has been an economic growth of 0.3%.
Yeah.
But it's clearly slower than it was previously.
Exactly. So that's the world situation. You have a sclerotic West, which dominates the world. And then you have these other powers which are gradually trying to break this old, structures that American imperialism has imposed on the planet. And that's causing a huge amount of frictions. And it is one of the fundamental, is probably at the moment, the fundamental element in world politics.
Yes, it is.
Now, behind this, there's a deeper crisis. We already touched on it. There's an economic crisis. Let's move on to the most crisis-ridden part of Western imperialism.
Yes.
Europe,
yeah.
And France in particular.
In fact, if you look at what we just said, the Alaska summit, what was Europe's reaction? I mean, at the Alaska summit, Trump was trying to reach a deal with Putin. And obviously the Europeans are not very happy with this. And they immediately rushed to the United States and they were lectured at the Oval Office. But those images, in the same way that the images coming from China paint a picture of the real relationship and the situation, the strengthening of China vis-a-vis the United States, the images of the European leaders in a subservient posture towards Trump paint the picture of really the impotence and the crisis-ridden character of European imperialist powers.
Exactly. Because, we have now the situation in France developing very fast.
Yes.
France is now set to lose in 4 days its second government in
a year.
Less than a year. Since was it?
December,
December.
Yeah.
Is it December they fell or in January? Anyway.
In December, it was threatened with overthrow. Then it finally fell in February, I think, or something.
And this is the Bayrou government is set to collapse. He has called a vote of confidence because he was unable to pass through a very, very harsh austerity budget of 41 billion euros of cuts on everything.
Including
healthcare, two
pensions.
holidays, pensions, sacking of government workers, all sorts. Very, very brutal attacks.
On top of another budgetary measure that they implemented in April of 5 billion cuts, and then another one they implemented earlier of another 4 billion cuts. So this is accumulating.
Yes, and so what we have now is the calling for a vote of confidence. Bayrou has called it himself.
Yes,
and I know. I mean, he's trying to play a political trick here. He says, "I'm promising you." You will end up in a deep economic crisis.
It's me or the chaos.
It's me or chaos.
But many people now think that chaos is probably better.
He's hoping that he's going to say this now, and then in a couple of years, when there's a deep economic crisis, then he can rise up
you so.
and say, "I told you so," and he can become the president. But there's two aspects of this. One is the enormous public debt of France, 3.5 trillion euros, and 114% of GDP.
Yes.
Last year, or this year, has been 5.8% budget deficit on top of that, which is almost twice the limit set by the European Union. Bond prices are going up. This debt is not being shaved off. In fact, they're going to spend around 75 billion euros per year just to pay the interest rate. So these 41 billion euros of cuts don't even cover
for it,
for the interest rate payments, let alone shaving off any of the debt. And on top of that, we have Mr. Macron, Mr. Coalition of the Willing, Mr. Ukraine, coming out and saying, we need to basically bending to the pressures of NATO and Trump on the one side, but also on his own imperialist binge, pushing up military spending to 5% was within 3 years or something, 4 years, without taking up any new debt.
It's 2% of GDP now. They wanted to bring it up to 3.5%, which is nearly double, and then eventually to 5%.
Without taking any new debt.
Yes.
Which means all of it has come through cuts
in social
spending. This really puts everything in perspective, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And this has caused a crisis, a political crisis.
Because the problem is that about 1 year ago, we had elections in France, and these elections were called by Macron, the president, in order to get a stable parliamentary majority. But what he got was the opposite. It was a completely fractured parliament in which the left coalition is the biggest party but doesn't have an overall majority. And he then's been spending a year cobbling up different governments with bits of support from here, bits of support from there, which are completely unstable because the main parties in parliament are unable to support a massive budget cuts that the situation requires from the point of view of the capitalists, because they know that any government, any party voting for those cuts will be decimated at the next election. So even Le Pen's party, the National Rally, has now refused to vote for this budget. And even the Socialist Party, which is the right wing of the left-wing coalition, they're always very happy to be part of government and help out in times of need. But even for them, this is perhaps too much, and they are likely also to vote against the motion of confidence on the 8th.
The capitalists can't rule. They can't rule as they used to.
No,
they can't carry out their program.
That's right. It will seem that there is now a contradiction between democracy, i.e. the parliament, which has been elected by the people, and the needs of the capitalists. They are in a collision course, one against the other.
Yes. And there's been protests called.
Yes, there's been some... this is a spontaneous movement. It's not been organized by any particularly known organization. It's just a call that was issued on social media for the 10th of September under the slogan, "Let's block everything." I.e. road blockades, people stopping paying the taxes, stop collaborating with the state. And it's a very vague call that was put out on social media, but it's taken up by millions of people as an avenue for expressing their anger and the frustration and the opposition to the government. By the way, Macron is now more unpopular than at the time of the Yellow Vests uprising a few years ago, of which this has many parallels with.
Yeah.
I think his popularity, only 15% of the French people support him, 80% oppose him, and Bayrou is even lower. He's got 14% support and 82% opposition. So yeah, this demonstrations have been, or this protest has been called, but this is not just a normal protest that is a demonstration going from one square to another. This is a call to stop the country, to bring the country to a halt and bring down the government. People are saying, okay, on the 8th, Bayrou will fall, the prime minister will fall, most likely.
Yeah.
Barring some last-minute maneuvers, but the government will fall on the 8th, and then on the 10th, we'll bring down Macron, the president. So this is the kind of mood that's been building up. The trade unions, which are really the organizations that should be at the head of this, they've been dragging their feet. Under pressure from below, they now said, there's going to be a day of action on the 10th, and then another one on the 16th, and perhaps later on in the month. And they're completely inadequate in their response to the situation. But there is the left wing of first of all, Mélenchon, the leader of the France Insoumise, the left wing organization, he said he put his weight behind this call for the 10th of September, says from the 10th of September, what we need is a general strike, an open-ended general strike. And I'm calling for this. This has been met with outrage by the bourgeois media. I saw an article in one of the French papers that said, from Mélenchon to Robespierre, France is being threatened with terror. You know what I mean? Which might make him even more popular. People do want some terror, some revolutionary terror against the ruling class in one way or another. But anyway, there's this scaremongering campaign. And then there is the left wing of the CGT. This is a grouping of left-wing federations and regional organizations of the CGT, which is the main trade union confederation in France, that stand on the left on a program of class struggle. This emerged after the big movement in 2023 against the pensions reform, pointing out the inadequacy of the leadership and the tactics of that movement. And so basically they are now calling, they say, yes, we should start an all-out general strike on the 10th, but this general strike should involve the occupation of workplaces. And basically they're saying we need to go back to the traditions of 1936 and 1968. This is the only way to reverse this massive program of cuts. And they even putting into question the question of the capitalist system. We must overthrow everything. In some sectors of the economy, like the energy sector, the strikes have already started on the 1st of September. Now the the civil servants federation of the CGT has also called for a strike on the 10th. So the movement is building up. And in fact, rather than the motion of no confidence on the 8th being a way of deactivating the social protest, which was the original intention, now it's become a way of spurring people into action. They say, okay, this government is weak. This government is going to fall on the 8th. Then let's kick them all out, basically, on the 10th. So basically, France, which has very revolutionary traditions, is building up to another social explosion, starting perhaps on the 10th of September.
Yes, we'll have to see about this. But we said at the time of the Yellow Vest movement, that this was an anticipation of revolutionary events in the future. And France does have a revolutionary tradition. Yes. The French people are very aware of their revolutionary. The fact that Robespierre is mentioned is not a small thing. You know, the English Revolution, not many people know about in Britain, but French people know about their revolutionary traditions. And they remember 1968, which was a revolutionary general strike, 10 million workers
with factory
striking.
occupations.
Factory occupations, calls for a popular government, a workers' government. We'll have to see. But definitely, that is the underlying latent mood in society in France. Yes. Everywhere, and not just in France, in fact, everywhere. But in France, this is one of the places that we could see
more
this
advanced
come to the fore. Should we just read out this CGT statement, because it's pretty, the left wing of the CGT, right?
It's called CGT. It's called CGT Unity, Unité CGT. It's a gathering of some of the most powerful industrial federations, including the Chemical Energy Workers Federation, some of the most biggest regional organizations like the departmental union around Marseille. I think also in the west, in the Loire-Atlantique, in the north part of Pas-de-Calais. So some of the biggest organizations, more industrial, heavy industrial organizations in the CGT are part of this left wing.
Yes. And this is a statement. I'm just going to read out some of the bits. I'm probably going to read out most of it because it's very good. It says, a new cycle of class warfare begins this September. The September 10th date, announced since July as a total lockdown of the country, is uniting a great deal of anger. Sorry, this is a Google Translate. So bear with us here. In reality, this mobilization echoes the powerful Yellow Vest movement of 2018 and the social mobilizations against pension reforms. Then further on, the Prime Minister is expected to fall on the 8th, the date of the confidence vote in Parliament. It doesn't matter if this government falls. It doesn't matter if the President appoints a new Prime Minister from the Socialist Party, the right or the far right, or decrees a new dissolution of the National Assembly. It's time for class struggle. Let's shift our focus, abandon the corporate and institutional agendas. Let's overflow the course of events. Let's instill a climate of social uprising everywhere against those who are destroying our lives. Let's anchor strikes in companies, occupy our workplaces, and block the economy, because France is in a regime crisis, even more so after 10 years of Macron. Legitimate resentment is exploding against political and economic elites who are plundering the country and exploiting workers. Those at the top can no longer do so, and those at the bottom no longer want so. By the way, the biggest antidote to the far right, this is absolutely correct, the biggest antidote to the far right is the struggle of the workers, side by side in the class struggle against the common enemy. Forward, this is aimed at Le Pen and those who say that we should unite with the liberals against the far right. These guys say no. The point is to
unite the class.
Unite the class against the liberals and the ruling class. Forward to block everything with the unity of the workers' camp through widespread strikes, offensive actions, and workplace occupations. Onward to spread the social movement to final victory. Onward to end the status quo, institutionalism, and capitalism, a world of exploitation, misery, famine, genocide, and horror. End of the world, end of the month is the same fight. I think that's a Google Translate mistranslation. Yes. Anyway. This is a very radical statement.
It's very radical statement. And the thing is that this is not a statement that's been published by a small revolutionary group. It's a statement that's been published by the left wing of the CGT. These are trade union militants who have learned some lessons from the past movements, the movement against the Yellow Vest movement in 2018, the movement against the pension reform in 2023. And they now say the only way that we must remember our own history. The only way that the workers will achieve anything is through mass movement and factory occupations and blockading the economy. So this is the first idea that is very important, that they realize and they put on the table that the working class has the power to stop society and has enormous power in capitalist society because of the way that the place they occupy in production. At a time when many people say, oh, the working class doesn't exist and this, but this will be shown probably in the next few days, who rules the country.
Yeah.
But the problem with this is that this then raises another question. If the workers paralyze the economy, which they're quite capable of doing it, and they've done before in France, then the question that's posed is who rules? Is it the workers or the capitalists?
Yeah.
And the question answers itself, isn't it? If the workers... this is a government of the capitalist for the capitalist. The comrades of the Revolutionary Communist Party in France, the French section of the RCI, they put it in their article, which I recommend comrades to read. But they said this same government that's asking for 45 billion in cuts, euros in cuts, has given 200 billion to the capitalists in handouts to the companies.
Yes.
And it's also paying, I think you gave the figure, I don't know how much in interests on the debt. Interest on the debt very soon will be a bigger item of expenditure than the whole of the education budget, for instance. So the question is clear. It's either us or them. Is a government and this is the question that's posed. Is it a government in the interest of the workers or a government in the interest of the capitalists? This is perhaps the thing that's missing from this statement. It goes very far.
Yeah.
But then the question, the next question that is posed by this action, if the workers occupy the factories, they stop the economy, then the question will be posed of, well, what we need is a workers' government.
Yes.
A government that responds to the interest of working people, i.e., a revolution. That's what is being raised.
That was what was. First of all, we don't know where this movement will go, but obviously this statement points in that direction.
Yes.
That was the question that was posed in 1968. Who rules the country? The workers had power in their hands.
Yes.
They controlled more the country, all of the main levers of the economy. They had the support of the vast majority of the population, but there wasn't the decision, the order to take power, and there wasn't a leadership capable of gathering this struggle and pointing the next way forward. Unfortunately, the Communist Party back then, the so-called Communist Party of France,
which was very strong
at that time was very strong, pulled back the movement and was punished heavily afterwards, and was discredited immensely amongst the working class. But at that moment, they lost the chance. Now, we are not at that stage where the struggle is lost. We're just beginning. The process is just beginning in France. But that is the fundamental question which needs to be raised. I was listening to a podcast, and we can say one of our competitors online, but so one of these podcasts that analyzes world events and the politics, and they were discussing this, and they say, no, the solution is, the problem is the EU.
Mm-hmm.
The EU is the problem, and the EU directives, and they can't. All of these problems can be solved, but it's just that the EU is too rigid and is controlling France. But that's not the problem. We explained this many, many years ago. The problem is the capitalist system.
Yes.
You have a situation where 20 years ago, in order to maintain the stability of the system back then, they were heading into a deep crisis.
Mm-hmm.
In order to save the system, to save their system and themselves, they gave all of these handouts. As you said, 200 billion. In reality, it's probably far more than 200. All of these 3.5 trillion, more or less, all of that has gone into the pockets of the bourgeois, one way or another.
With the bailout of the banks at that time, and then the COVID bailout.
Yeah, they've been having a bonanza in the stock markets, and they've been speculating all this stuff, and now that money has to be paid. That debt has to be paid. That's how capitalism works. And the question is, who's going to pay it? Bayrou is right when he says, within the confines of this system,
there's no other solution.
There's no other solution. The system needs a tax. You can either have it, the government doing it as they are, or you can have it as an uncontrolled or semi-uncontrolled kind of.
He's even raised the idea of an IMF bailout of France.
They've been talking about the IMF bailout.
Yeah.
I was reading, I think it was Politico today. They were saying that, you can't go all in because there's mass opposition from the working class, essentially. You can't carry out these cuts. So what you're just going to have is a controlled
demolition,
unraveling of the whole economy, long-term gradual decline, which will also mean what?
Massive social explosion.
Massive social explosions.
Yeah. The thing is that the interesting question is, when they raised this idea of an IMF bailout, they also said this about Britain. But the problem is the IMF doesn't have the capacity to bail out an economy like France or Britain. In 2015, when there was the European debt crisis, the crisis was mainly centered in what they said the PEAKS countries: Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. These are peripheral countries. Particularly Greece is a very small part of the European capitalist economy.
Yeah.
So at some point there could be a bailout of Greece at the time, at a very high price for the Greek working people, obviously, but that was within reason. But now the crisis of European capitalism is affecting the core countries of European capitalism: Germany, France, Britain. Britain is not part of the European Union, but it's also a European country. And therefore, this means that this crisis is much more untractable. And the same scenes of class struggle and massive confrontations that we saw at the time in Spain, in Portugal, in Greece, we will now see in Germany. In France, we've seen many of these over the last 10 years, but in Germany, which is not the country of class struggle for the last 10 or 15 years, it's been more or less stable. But now this stability is completely been upset. The crisis of German capitalism has been massively aggravated by the idiotic or counterproductive decision to participate in sanctions on Russia. And now the same explosion of class struggle that we are seeing or is being prepared in France will then follow immediately in Germany, no doubt.
Yes, I was reading that the Germany is now in a deep crisis, as you say, and it's directly related to fuel prices.
Exactly.
So,
yes, energy.
And then they still go on about the coalition of the willing. They have a meeting today as we record. Actually, we'll see how that goes. Probably going to end up nowhere. They're all ratcheting up military spending. And while at the same time, the world economy is breaking up, international trade is declining, China is coming in as a massive competitor to these economies, undermining and underbidding
in Europe,
these European economies. America withdrawing, which means, again, militarily withdrawing, which will mean increase desire for the European capitalists and bourgeois to maintain their own militaries and own military postures. What does that mean? I think Merz, the chancellor in Germany, put it very, very succinctly. He said, the welfare state that we have today can no longer be financed with what we produce in the economy. That is the level. And that is a message, not just to Germany, but as you say, everywhere in Europe. This is just the beginning. What we see is a system which is completely incapable of of maintaining the level of living standards that the working class had acquired in the previous period.
Yes.
And
in the case of Germany, we have to remember that this is a government that is a coalition of the two main parties of the bourgeois system in Germany, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, the Conservatives and the Social Democrats. And now, for the first time, I've seen an opinion poll this week that the AfD, the anti-establishment right-wing demagogic party, is now ahead in the opinion polls, is now overtaken the CDU. And the more this government continues with these policies, the more it will fuel anti-establishment parties of the right, but to a certain extent also of the left. But anyone who's against the establishment will gain from this, quite clearly.
But more importantly for us, this will lead to a series of social strife and class struggle, intense class struggle, because the European working class is going to have a very sharp awakening.
Yes.
They can already feel it now. Everywhere you go, people are complaining. They're stretched to their limits. But the cuts and attacks that we're going to see is going to be far, far worse. Yes. Now, the pensions is the biggest thing at the moment. They're talking about cutting pensions. What does that mean? That means people who've worked their whole lives, contributed to this economy, while the rich has gotten richer and richer and richer and richer, and are having their pensions taken away. They're now in France and in Germany, if I'm not mistaken, they're talking about like a pensions kind of wealth tax, i.e. pensioners who have saved up a little bit, so working class people who made a little bit more and made a separate pension, they should pay an extra tax so that the poorest pensioners can have a pension. No one talks about touching the money of the rich, obviously. Just the pensioners who can just make do are going to have to pay for the pensioners who can't. 10 million pensioners in Germany at the moment are living below the poverty line, getting 1,100 euros per month, which is nothing in Germany. And even that cannot be sustained. And then there's the healthcare, there's the
and the situation
system
in Britain is not far off from this. We now see the so-called bond vigilantes demanding that the government implements more cuts, even. But the government in Britain also has this problem that when they attempted to introduce the cuts just before the summer, there was a rebellion. Well, I wouldn't call it a rebellion. It was a rumbling in the parliamentary party, and they were forced to backtrack. So those were cuts. I think they were worth 5 or 6 billion pounds. They need to find cuts worth 20 billion pounds just to start off. They're now paying over 100 billion just in interests of the debt. That's money that the state is handing over to capitalists, bankers, and speculators every year in exchange for nothing. And this money is going up. So there's no wonder that the Starmer government is now the most unpopular government, most unpopular Labour government ever. It's now polling under 20%. And obviously this economic crisis is provoking a political, social crisis.
So, but from this, obviously there's two sides to this. One is immeasurable pain and suffering coming down on the European working class, like working class people everywhere. But on the other side, this will open up a revolutionary period.
Exactly. And
why are we discussing this? Obviously, this is a signal that we need to be ready for. We as communists, we have foreseen this. If you go back 20 years ago and look at our documents, our World Perspectives documents, I remember back then Alan said, all of this debt, they said this debt was a way of pushing the crisis into the future at the cost of an even bigger crisis later on. And then he said that all attempts to reestablish the economic equilibrium will destroy the social and political equilibrium.
Exactly.
20 years later, that is exactly what's happening, and that has just started. But that's not the end of the road. Obviously, the point is that we need to be ready to intervene in these movements. We are standing in front of intense class struggle, revolutionary events at the heart of Europe, and we need to build an organization that's big enough and powerful enough and strong enough to intervene in these protests. Because as long as these movements stay within the confines of the system, nothing will fundamentally change. And then there is actually a chance of Bayrou coming back. If you see whoever, if this government falls and some other government comes to power, whether it's Le Pen or even if it's Mélenchon, who's been saying all the right things. But if he doesn't break with the system, we're going to see an even worse situation ending up in 2 years.
Which is what happened 10 years ago in Greece.
Exactly. And then you can have a return of the right wing and the liberals and all of these gangs as a certain segment of the population clutches for stability. That will not be the end of the struggle, of course, either. But that is what we have to understand in order to find a way out of this morass. It's a break with capitalism. This is a result of the insoluble contradictions of the system itself. Speaking of revolution, let's move on to our last point, which is Indonesia. There's been a powerful revolutionary movement developing in Indonesia, almost out of the blue, I would say, not entirely. Our comrades, in fact, had predicted it.
Yes.
But very, very powerful movement, which started with the raising of parliamentary economic benefits, basically. Allowances to what is basically 50 times the normal average worker's wage. I think it's like $3,000 a month.
Provocation.
Sorry again?
It was a provocation.
It was a complete provocation at a time where the economic situation of the masses worsening massively. It's funny that people don't trust the statistics coming out of Indonesia anymore because the statistics say everything is going well. But obviously, when you ask people, that's not the case. Right. It's clear that there's fiddling. But you can't wish away hunger, can you? And suffering. Unemployment is rising. Wages are declining. Prices are going up. And in this situation, they decide to raise their allowances. And this provoked a protest movement, spontaneous protest movement of young people, students, high school students, on the 25th of August. They were then heavily attacked and repressed. Hundreds of people were arrested. The following day, even more people came out. And in this situation, one delivery driver was killed. This delivery driver, obviously, this is a common job. This is a large segment of the Indonesian society sustain itself via this kind of informal jobs, delivering and selling items. So obviously, this was a fate that many people could relate to, and that had completely exploded the situation. Thousands and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets, attacking the houses, government buildings, attacking houses of MPs.
Yes.
Live streaming it with showing the luxurious lifestyles, and all of this is just
including the residence of the finance minister as well.
And all of this is just spurring on the movement because people can see the disgusting inequality that exists, that these people living in extreme opulence, whereas the majority are living in from day to day. Just one thing, one of the elements of this, I think, is telling of the situation in the world is the way that the MPs have reacted in the most tone-deaf way.
Yes,
they've come out. Not that we expect anything else from them, but it's kind of symptomatic. Some of them have come out and say, well, they only have a food allowance of, 12 million rupiah per month, which is just their food allowance is 3 times the amount of a normal working class wage, entire wage. Yes. And someone says, they need an extra apartment because otherwise they're going to be stuck in traffic. And people are saying, well,
Yes.
tens of thousands and thousands of people are getting up before daylight in order to travel into Jakarta and other big areas in order to work. In other words, the complete detachment from ordinary life that these people have.
Yes.
It's quite incredible. And all of this is obviously bringing out the class anger and class rage in society. And it's opened up the revolutionary situation.
That's right. And as it's classic with these movements, the start of spontaneous movement, the regime, the government tried to use first repression. Repression didn't stop the movement, and then they attempted with some concessions. I think they cancelled the parliamentary allowances or temporarily cancelled them, but this is also not stopping the movement, and the movement is going forward, and people are saying, well, they should all go. This is not just a struggle for one particular demand or this particular measure, it's a struggle against the whole regime. They should all go. And I think there are very strong parallels with what's happening in Indonesia and what happened earlier 1 year ago in Bangladesh, where there was a revolutionary movement that started with the youth and ended up by overthrowing the government. And what happened in Sri Lanka a few years back? Was it in 2020 or 2019? I can't remember exactly. That is a revolutionary movement that starts spontaneously from the youth, but that then gathers the whole of the opposition against the regime, socio-economic factors, political factors, democratic factors, and that ends up with the overthrow of these regimes. Now, we don't know whether in Indonesia this will reach the same degree, whether the regime will be overthrown or not, but I think that it is important to draw lessons from these other movements. Because some people have been asking, but what happened in Sri Lanka? What's the situation in Sri Lanka today? Exactly. What's the situation in Bangladesh today? Yeah, there are different governments. A government that rode the wave of the movement that seems more close to the people has come to power in Sri Lanka. And same in Bangladesh. Some of the student leaders are now part of a provisional government that's led by a Nobel Peace Prize of Economy, this Dr. Yunus. But in fact, the living conditions of the masses have not changed. The problem of the debt has not changed. The problem of working conditions, the problem of poverty, inequality, and so on has not changed because capitalism remains. So I think that it is important to understand that the spontaneous movements will arise once and again in countries like Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, as it happened in other countries earlier, in Sudan, in Chile, in India. But what is necessary is not just a change of the political form of government or a cosmetic change of the regime. What is necessary is the uprooting of the capitalist system, which is at the bottom of these problems that people are fighting against.
Yes, I mean, we have a series of very good articles. And one of the points that they make is, what is a revolution? And I think this is an important question because it goes to the heart of the matter. As serious revolutionaries, we need to study what happens, the mechanics of a revolution, the laws of a revolution. And the questions that you ask are very pertinent. Everyone should ask, well, what happened in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and all of these places? Now, a revolution is when the masses enter the stage of politics, is when ordinary people decide that we're not going to leave it up to the experts anymore. They realize that the experts don't represent their interests, the so-called experts, the politicians, the big businessmen, and so on. And they start intervening in politics. They start taking matters into their own hands. That doesn't mean that they have a fully finished program. In fact, they don't have any program to start with. They don't know anything of what they want, what kind of society they want. That is never how a revolution begins. But they know what they don't want. They cannot tolerate the state of affairs anymore. But going into a struggle,
or as the CGT left statement says, those at the top can no longer rule in the same way. Those at the bottom can no longer tolerate to be
no longer live in the same way.
Yeah.
That is precisely the fundamental opening of a revolution. But in the course of a struggle, consciousness develops extremely fast. The things that we as Marxists and communists understand by studying the nature of the state, the nature of private property, the class divisions in society. Many people learn that from books. If they're communists, of course, doesn't mean they don't experience it, but they get an understanding of it from books. But the masses learn all of this through events and through practice, by going out on the streets, pushing forward and seeing in practice who is on their side and who is not. And step by step, they develop a program, basically. And if this process was allowed to continue, it would invariably move towards a socialist revolution. Because they would see that the fundamental problems in this society is not this or that ruler, but a whole class of people who own and control the main levers of the economy and the state institutions in society. The point is, this process is not a straight line and is time limited. Why? Because one, there's a limit to how much you can be on the streets. It's a very tiring experience to be on the streets day in and day out. And at the same time, you have an enemy who is not just sitting still. They learn from their mistakes, and they have many different strategies. They're much better organized than the masses are. They have institutions, they have think tanks, they have strategists. Yes, in the beginning, anything they do spurs the movement onwards. But as tiredness begins to set in, then they have their agents within the movement. They have the liberal Democrats who say, oh, we need democracy, we need this and that. They have the parliamentary cretinists, they have the so-called left and the trade union leaders who all try to diffuse and hold back the movement.
Oh, we should not fall into anarchy and looting.
Oh,
and
yes, we
like
should.
This.
All the lefts who are in Indonesia now say, oh, we shouldn't loot. And all of them serving to undermine the movement and confuse it and disorient it. And at a certain point, this tiredness will, if it's not, if the movement is not carried through to its end, taking power and consolidating it, as in taking state power, essentially, by the movement, then it will be tired out. And you can see that like in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, all these liberals, and everything goes back to normal. You can ask the Sudanese revolution. Sudan is now falling apart. That's not necessarily going to happen in Indonesia. In Egypt, you had 2 revolutions and 5 uprisings from 2011 to 2013. What was the result? Because there wasn't, the movement was not organized enough and conscious enough, as Lenin said, to carry itself through to the end. It paved the way for the Sisi government, which is hated, by the way, but which nevertheless managed to consolidate itself. So,
if you want an historical parallel, what you had in Egypt in 2011, what you had in Bangladesh 1 year ago, what you had in Sri Lanka at the time when they overthrew the government, was a February revolution, the initial spontaneous mass movement of the people to overthrow the old regime. But what they did not have was an October revolution, the time at which the oppressed, the working people, take power into their own hands. And what is the main difference between Russia, February to October 1917, and Egypt 2011, Bangladesh last year, and even Indonesia today, is the lack of revolutionary leadership, the lack of revolutionary leadership that puts all these things together, that makes conscious the unconscious advance of consciousness of the masses, and that directs all the energies towards the final victory, which is the taking of power by the working class and the oppressed. That's what's missing.
Precisely.
And this is what we are doing, basically, with the Revolutionary Communist International, is building a revolutionary leadership that can participate in events and point the way forward towards the victory of our class.
Yes, we do that from the US to France to Indonesia and every country in between. And if you are interested in these ideas, if you agree with these ideas, we encourage you to join us and to prepare for these events, because they are coming to every single country in the world. I think that is kind of the conclusion of this episode. The world capitalist system is at a total dead end and is going into a crisis in one country after another. Starting, obviously, it hits its periphery the worst, countries like Indonesia, but it's now also affecting the heart of the system in particular in the West. And from there, that crisis will again flow back out. So, you know, like when you get an infection in your heart, and it's going to be following the bloodstream into the rest of the body. And flowing from that is going to be a crossroad for humanity. Which way are we going down? The barbarism that capitalism offers, or a socialist society where the working class people take power into their own hands? And that's what we're fighting for. That's what we're about.
Precisely.
Do you have any final words?
No, that's the only struggle that is worth living for. I mean, if you live in this period of history and you see everything that's going on around you, the genocide in Gaza, the climate crisis, political instability, racist pogroms against scapegoating of migrants, and all of this, then the only thing to do is to try to understand why this is happening and then get organized in order to change the course of history.
I think that's the perfect ending. Pleasure to be back with you, Jorge, and with all of you guys out there. We will now resume our regular weekly podcast every Thursday at 6 p.m. UK time. My name is Hamid Alizadeh. This was Jorge Martín, and we'll see you again next week.